Yeah, hi everyone. So I'm Julia Mikolai. I think we met yesterday, most of us. I'm a senior research fellow in the Migrant Life Project, and today I'm going to present joint work together with Hill Kuru on the partnership, fertility, and employment trajectories of immigrants in the UK using a three-channel sequence analysis approach. So probably the audience is aware that partnership formation and dissolution, as well as fertility and employment of immigrants, are all important indicators of their lives, as well as their integration into host societies. And in line with this, many studies exist on these life domains. But previous studies have mainly analyzed these domains separately, although we are aware of some studies that have analyzed two of the three life domains jointly. So for example, employment and fertility, like we saw in the previous presentation, or fertility and family trajectories, as some previous migrant life papers have done, for example. But actually, we don't know of any studies that attempted to study the complex interlinkages between all three of the life domains of partnership, fertility, and employment. So in this study, we aim to fill this knowledge gap by jointly analyzing trajectories of partnerships, fertility, and employment of immigrants. And to do so, we use multi-channel sequence analysis. In this study, we focus on the UK, which has a long migration history. So basically, the key aims of this study are firstly to understand how partnership, fertility, and employment trajectories of immigrants evolve jointly over time since migration. Secondly, to investigate the patterns of employment, partnership, and family formation. And finally, to explore the characteristics of immigrants with these different patterns. To do this, we use data from the UK Household Longitudinal Study, which is also often referred to as Understanding Society. Here we use 2009 to 2019 waves. And there are two particularly great things about this dataset for our analysis. Firstly, that it contains retrospective union, fertility, and employment histories. And secondly, that it contains immigrant and ethnic minority boost samples, which allows for the first time in the UK really to analyze the lives of migrants in detail. I shall mention that employment histories are only available for a subset of individuals in the dataset. So in this analysis, we have just shy of 2,500 immigrants, all of whom arrived in the UK aged 18 to 49 between 1956 and 2014. We follow them for 5 years after their arrival to the UK. And all individuals in our sample have to have complete partnership, fertility, and employment histories. This is a requirement for sequence analysis. First, we analyze the trajectories of women and men together. And then I'm also going to show you how their trajectories look like when we look at them separately. As I mentioned many times, we use multi-channel sequence analysis to analyze the joint evolution of the three life domains of immigrants during the first 5 years after their arrival in the UK. And multi-channel sequence analysis is basically an extension to simple sequence analysis, which is used to analyze just one life domain of individuals. So if we pretend for a minute that we're only interested in studying the partnership trajectories of immigrants, then here I have depicted the partnership trajectory of an imaginary individual. And we see that this trajectory is a sequence of states. So this person was single for 3 months after migration to the UK, then they were cohabiting for a year and then married for another year after that. So during the analysis, we identify these individual sequences for each person in the dataset. Then we use cluster analysis to group together individuals with similar trajectories in such a way that those who are similar are grouped into the same clusters and those who are different enough are grouped into different clusters. And finally, these clusters can then be used as the outcome variable in a multinomial logistic regression to understand how different individual characteristics influence the propensity to belong to different types of trajectories. This is like a very simplistic explanation of how sequence analysis works. And then when we're interested in multiple life domains, we can use the extended version of sequence analysis that takes into account multiple dimensions simultaneously. So in this case, we have the same imaginary individual, and we have already looked at their partnership trajectory, but now we also have their fertility and employment trajectory on top of this. So we can see that, for example, this person was childless when they were single and they were in full-time employment. Then halfway through their cohabitation, they had a child and subsequently became inactive on the labor market. And around halfway through their marriage, they had the second child, and at this time they were part-time employed. So in our analysis, we have the following states in each domain. In the partnership domain, individuals can either be single, cohabiting, married, or separated or widowed. If somebody repartners, then they go back into the cohabiting or married status. In the fertility domain, individuals can either be childless or have 1, 2, or 3+ children. And finally, in the employment domain, people can either be full-time employed or part-time employed, self-employed, be in education, inactive, or unemployed. To conduct the multi-channel sequence analysis, we use the TremMiner package in R. So this graph summarizes our main results. And before I walk you through this graph and explain our findings, I just firstly want to highlight just the way the results are depicted in multi-channel sequence analysis. So first, we have the partnership trajectories on the top, fertility trajectories in the middle, and employment trajectories on the bottom. And the 3 types of trajectories that we have identified, we have to read in this way. So this is the type 1 trajectory, this is the second type, and this is the third type. And then also just to quickly say what the colors mean, because I'm not sure how legible these are. So we have in the partnership trajectories, single, cohabiting, married, and separated or widowed. Then in the fertility domain, we have the childless, 1, 2, and 3+ children. And in the employment domain, we have the full-time employed, those in education, inactive, which is this faded yellow, part-time employed, self-employed, and unemployed. Okay, so as I mentioned, we identified 3 joint trajectory types of partnership, fertility, and employment of immigrants. The first group consists of individuals who arrived as and also largely remained as unpartnered during the 5-year observation window. The majority were also childless. And most of them also remain childless when they arrive, 5 years after migration. Regarding their employment trajectories, around 60% of them were in full-time education when they arrived to the UK, and around half of these individuals then became full-time employed 5 years after migration. We also have a large share of those who were part-time employed. But we label this group as single childless students, and around 21% of the analytical sample belongs to this group. The second group includes immigrants who were either single or partnered when they arrived to the UK. And then most of them experienced at least one partnership change, such that by the end of the 5-year period, only around 20% of them are never partnered. Most of them remain childless throughout the whole 5-year observation period, but around 40% of them had one child 5 years after migration. Regarding their employment trajectories, around 60% are full-time employed at the time of arrival, and around 2 years after, this proportion goes up to 80%, and it stays at 80% all the way to 5 years after migration. We also have a small share who are part-time employed. We label this group as partner childless full-time employed, and 36% of the analytical sample belongs to this group. And finally, the third group consists of migrants who were already married at the time of migration, mostly, and by the end of the 5-year observation window, almost everybody is married, and few are separated. Also, most of them, around 60%, had at least one child at the time of migration, and then many make the transition to either a first or a subsequent child, again in such a way that almost all of them have at least one child 5 years after migration. Regarding their employment domain, individuals in this group are either employed, mainly full-time or part-time, or inactive. and we do not actually see many changes over time in their employment status. We call this group family migrants, and they are the largest group in the sample. 43% of the sample belongs to this group. So this was basically the first two aims of the study, to understand the joint evolution of trajectories in 3 life domains and to understand what patterns we observe. The last aim was to understand the characteristics of immigrants who belong to these different trajectories. So the next 3 graphs will show the results of the multinomial logistic regression in the form of average marginal effects with 95% confidence intervals, where the outcome variable is the cluster variable with 3 categories. And just as a reminder, I have copied on the left just the sequences for each of the types. In the analysis, we have migrant origin, migration cohort, age at arrival, level of education, and sex. Okay, so what we see here is that there are relatively little differences between different migrant groups in the propensity to belong to the single childless students cluster. We see that those from India are somewhat less likely to belong to this cluster than those from EU countries, whereas those from African countries and other countries are more likely to belong to this group than EU migrants. More recent migrants and those who are younger at the time of arrival tend to belong to this group, and more educated individuals and men are also more likely to belong to this group than less educated individuals and women. Secondly, we look at the propensity to belong to the partner childless full-time employed group. So this group is mainly represented by immigrants from EU countries, the rest of Europe and other Western countries, and the Caribbean. All other migrant groups are less likely to belong to this cluster than these groups. We also see that immigrants in this group tend to be from older migrant generations. Older individuals at the time of arrival are less likely to be in this group, and highly educated individuals and men are more likely to be in the partner childless full-time employed than less educated individuals and women. And finally, we have the family migrants. We see that immigrants from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh are most likely to belong to this cluster, but those from Africa and other countries also have higher propensities than those from EU countries to belong to this group. We see no differences by migration cohort, but we see that those who were older at the time of arrival are more likely to be clustered as family migrants than those who were younger. And immigrants in this group tend to be low educated and women. So given the gender differences that we saw in the previous step of analysis, we also wanted to further investigate whether we also see gender differences in the trajectories of immigrants. Sorry. So what we see among men, we find actually quite similar clusters to what we found for the overall samples. This is especially the case for their partnership and fertility trajectories. And then when we look at their employment trajectories, we see that they tend to be full-time employed, especially in the second group, almost everybody is full-time employed, but also in the first and third clusters, the share of full-time employed is much higher than it was in the overall sample. Among women, we find some more differences. Among women, the first cluster is similar to kind of a mix of the first two clusters in the overall sample. So this has single and some partnered individuals who are mainly childless. And women in this cluster also have relatively high shares of full-time employed or students, and some are part-time employed. So actually this first cluster is quite similar to the first cluster for men, especially in terms of employment trajectories. But then the second and third cluster among women are mainly family migrants. And so you can see that they are all married or almost all married at the time of arrival. But the main difference between these two groups is in terms of family size. So in the second cluster, around 60% had already 3 or more children at the time of arrival. And then 5 years after migration, everybody has 3 or more children. whereas the third group represents those who end up with 2 children. And most importantly, what we see here is that these partnership and childbearing trajectories are coupled with mainly inactivity on the labor market in both groups, and that the share of those who are in full-time employment is a lot smaller, and a lot smaller than among men. So to quickly conclude, we firstly showed that partnership, fertility, and employment trajectories of immigrants are indeed interrelated. Single immigrants are unlikely to have children, and they tend to study full-time or have a part-time job. Many immigrants in a relationship tend to work full-time, especially men, and having children is associated with being in a relationship and with heterogeneous employment trajectories, especially among women. Secondly, we showed that there is heterogeneity in these patterns. We found different patterns by migrant origin, sex, and education. We also highlighted that immigrants' labor market position is gendered, that the lower labor market participation rates and the lower probability of employment that was also found in previous studies mainly characterizes immigrant women, and these patterns are coupled with their partnership and childbearing trajectories. Although many native women are also likely to work part-time in the UK after having children, the low employment rates among partnered migrant women with children is quite striking. So our results highlight that immigration and integration policies need to consider a multitude of experiences among immigrants in the UK. Thanks very much, and I look forward to hearing your questions or comments, and you can download the working paper if you scan this QR code. Thank you.